Marco?
Sean.
I have nothing.
I don't believe you. You always have something. It's like serving.
I'm afraid to make a joke at the expense of a company's name.
No, we don't. We
don't
have to make
anybody. I'm like, I have a joke. No, I'm not going to do.
We don't have to be funny all the time. I mean, you're naturally funny, so I just follow.
I'm told.
But the tension, Sean, it's this. I love to play ping pong, tennis table, and it's kind of like I wait for you to serve. You have no idea where it's coming. If it's going to be a spin but now you tell me nothing. That alone already put me in the corner. So I don't know what to do anymore.
That's right.
But no, it doesn't matter. What it really matters is that we are on the chats on the road to Black Hat 2023 Las Vegas. And with that, it comes everything else that happened around that. DEF CON, besides, and many, many other events, Squad Con, and many more.
Yep.
And we tease some event that happened there, some talk, so that people that actually are going to be in Vegas, they can go and take part and listen to people making this fantastic presentation. So just in case you forgot about it, I reminded you.
So I did forget why we did this. No, I think there's so much content at Black Hat, and we kick off the series with Steve Wiley, the GM of the conference, and he gives us a nice overview. But then I go in and find sessions that I think are really cool and that our audience would like to hear about. And this is one of them. Real world case of security technologies being employed and doing so to help the business and not screw with the user experience too much. And so the story is really cool to me. I'm the ops guy, as you know, Marco. So we're not going to get all the details today, but John Swanson's with us, and he's going to share a bit about his session, which is actually called, I was tasked with enrolling millions of developers in 2FA, which is two-factor auth. And here's what happened. So that's the story he's going to tell at Black Hat. We're going to get a snippet of that from him today and talk about that. The 2FA challenge at broad strokes as well. But before we do that, John, who are you? What's your role at GitHub and the driver behind presenting this to the Black Hat? It's not an easy feat to get a presentation selected there.
Yeah. So first, thanks for having me. This is really fun. My name is John Swanson. I'm the director of security strategy at GitHub. GitHub, I imagine most of your audience will know who GitHub is, but just in case, we're really about empowering developers, and we've got about 100 million developers on the platform. And part of this work is really about better protecting them. What kind of drove me to give this talk is obviously we want to bring some awareness to the effort that we'll talk about in more detail. But I think also, this is a tricky area for folks in that it is very simple on the surface, but there's a careful balancing act. And I think you referenced it in your introduction. It's how do we balance the usability and the security outcomes that we want to produce a great experience that better protects the entire software ecosystem.
And doesn't knock you over in the process.
That's right. Us or our customers. That's really important.
Yeah, exactly. So let's talk about, let's see where to start here, because there's so many things we can get into. I think the importance of two-factor auth in GitHub, I think most people can probably recognize the value of that. And I don't know what stats you're going to share in the session, but generally speaking, do you feel people embraced a technology like that? Generally speaking, and what were you expecting as they enabled that feature once it was deployed?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. And, I had a slide that I eventually cut in my talk, and it was, 2FA is increasingly ubiquitous. It's much more normalized than it used to be. So is this worthy of this kind of effort? But I think the answer to that question is yes. I think it's something like 80% of breaches according to the FIDO Alliance, they believe still stem from social engineering and account takeover or similar. And so I think it's still a problem space that's significant. And when we look at the broader software security or the software supply chain and the security of it, there's a lot of conversation about zero-day exploits and compromising build pipelines and things like that. But at the end of the day, if an engineer or developer's account is compromised, it's game over. And we think this is a really impactful way to move the needle on this. And we think GitHub has a position sort of some responsibility in some senses. We have 100 million developers on the platform. A substantial amount of the open source software is built, at least in part, on GitHub. And we really think this is a good opportunity for us to raise the bar for everyone.
Yeah, I'm going to get in with the idea that we know we need this at not just developer, not just B2B or in specific industry. And it's so hard, right? I mean, just go tell that to your mom or someone else that use a 2FA. Now, do I have to do that? So the experience that you get from these versus the experience that, that compromise between easy to use, more secure, which I never understood why we have to choose between the two. But, what does this story tells you to by thinking to a wider audience as well?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the crux of the challenge, and this is what makes it so interesting, and it was sort of fascinating for me to be involved with. A couple of years ago, I was responsible for transitioning GitHub internally from a good 2FA setup to an even stronger one around WebAuthn and increasing our phishing resistance. And I got a really good look at sort of that experience, that balancing act of the usability and the security properties. And we had to figure out how to do it right so that our employees didn't have a bad experience with it. We were very successful with that at the end of the day, but I was able to carry a lot of those lessons into this work when we started looking at the broader platform. And, we looked at a lot of data as part of our research for the program. And we invested quite heavily in user security historically. We have a number of features in this space. So it's not a case of like GitHub wasn't doing its due diligence or didn't have great features in this space, but we still looked at the data and still believed that we could create a better user experience. So we did a number of different things, and I'm happy to go into some level of detail about those, but we really emphasized that for about a year before we ever touched any kind of enrollment or enforcement, if you will. So I think really critically, you have to look at what the data can tell you about the friction your users are experiencing, find the pain points, and effectively target those with deliberate investments and improvements in the user experience. So as very brief examples, we looked at the rate of downloading or printing recovery codes, because we found that folks weren't doing that very frequently. So we targeted some improvements to drive that up. We also looked at how folks interact with factors. Do they configure one factor? Do they configure two factors? And we tried to see how we could move the needle on that to make it more resilient, if you will, their setups. And then obviously, I think we've got some things going on in the ecosystem, which will start to make this better too. We've got passkeys coming along now, and there's still some evolution that I think needs to happen there. But I see a lot of really good progress in the ecosystem. But I think passkeys, which we actually released in public beta last month, will probably mean that 2FA becomes much more accessible and reliable and durable going forward.
So talk to me a bit about setting up the program. Sounds like you've personally had a lot of time to think about it, do it in some instances in different scope. What was the driver, I guess, for initiating the program, and who is involved in kind of determining here's generally what we want to do, the scope of it, kind of, so that upfront part of actually saying that this is what we plan to do and we think it might take this long.
Yeah, so this is probably a good opportunity to tell a little bit of a story, and I kind of get into this in my talk, but I think it's good background, and we can share it here as well. But for a number of years at GitHub, I was responsible for building and leading our incident response, threat detection, and threat intelligence capabilities. And during a lot of that time, we were involved in investigating compromises that occurred on the platform as well, not just at GitHub. So though we don't have a formal like accountability for a user account that is compromised through social engineering, GitHub strongly believes that we're an important part of the security of the broader ecosystem. And so we invested time and cycles in investigating and remediating and notifying those cases when we found them. But over time, I began to think about what can we do better here? And as I mentioned, like we were investing fairly heavily in user security. We've got things like compromised password detection. We have user device verification, which helps with those types of cases. But when you see it somewhat frequently, it's something that you think a lot about, and you think about, well, how can we improve this? So a couple of years ago now, our chief security officer pulled me aside one day and said, how would you feel about a change of scenery effectively? And he asked me if I was willing to go and lead this sort of cross-functional effort among a good number of teams, which was really in many ways more of a product effort than not. And that's not really my background. I'm an incident responder by trade. But he was looking for somebody who had that broader context to go and be involved. And so that's where things started. Basically, we then built a broad collaborative project team focused around not only sort of the identity engineering folks who would be responsible for most of the technical and the platform changes to make it happen in practice, but also a broad cast of other characters. And I think this is really important. We involve folks from internal communications, public relations, legal, support was extremely important, and our customer success functions as well, to really bring in as many perspectives as we could during both the research and the planning phases, and then also in the execution phases. I'm happy to go into more detail about those if they're interesting. But I think that's a real key part of the project.
It is. What I'd like to hear from you, and you touch on it in the description of your session, it's the word principles. And I'm wondering if you can share what they are, or at least kind of paint a picture there for how you rally this team. I've led cross-functional teams before, and it can be challenging if you don't have like complete control over them to do what they want to do. You have competing priorities. Yours doesn't hardly ever make the list until somebody else says they must. So how do you define the guiding principles that everybody can not just agree to, but be happy to commit to?
I wondered about this, and especially when you are a security professional that's being asked to go sort of lead an effort that's primarily a product effort, you wonder how that's going to go. I think as a starting point, I'm very grateful for the folks that I work with and the culture that we have internally. They've always been great when security raises its hand and says, hey, we need to take on some work or look at a hard problem. But I think there's a sort of an ethos or something endemic to our culture, where we really believe that the security of the broader ecosystem is important, and that's outside of security itself. This runs across the business. We are a consumer of open source software, just like anybody else, and this is a huge opportunity. All of us agree, everybody who's done the work, to sort of raise the bar and help protect not only GitHub, but the entire community. We really think it's part of our responsibility, our core responsibility, to help protect the broader community and developers and make software safer all around. So that's a huge thing, and I think that made it very easy. No one had to ask me why. I never had to explain why to anyone. It was clearly evident from the start why we were investing in this work. Now, in terms of the rest of our operating principles, for me, it's pretty simple, I think, and I'll talk more about this in my talk. But good collaborative practices, very open, honest, transparent. Make sure folks have space to speak their mind, to represent their needs or interests or priorities effectively. Show openness and gratitude for the work that's done very transparently and visibly. I think that helps create a safe and healthy environment. Now, about the work itself, I'm actually going to share a couple of the principles sort of directly during the talk, but what they really boil down to is sort of balancing, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of security outcomes and the usability. I like to say that if security isn't usable, it isn't security at all. So I think that is kind of the overriding ethos of the principles internally in terms of like the tactical program itself. That was something that we really kind of set down in stone and have adhered to as somewhat of a North Star during the program.
So you mentioned culture, like maybe I didn't really mark it down, but at least 3 times in the last a few minutes, and I'm a big fan of that. I was reading your bio, and you have a master of actually a degree in political science, which I do. It's the art of compromise politics. So let's talk about culture a little bit. I mean, either you I know you're going to talk about that in the presentation. I don't want you to give that up, but in general, your approach, historically speaking, as society, why so hard this security? Why it's so hard to implement all of this? And what is the role of culture? Because for me, culture means way more than the technology. I mean, the role of cultural changes, it's more efficient and effective than the technology itself if you cannot put it in place. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think whether this is circumstance or it's more common than most of us would be led to believe, I think a lot of the problems that I've worked on are really human problems and not technical problems at their core. And obviously, as a sort of a career incident responder before this interesting turn in my career, you really are focused on human problems. They have a technical underpinning, but that is an exercise in trying to drive the human outcomes that you need. And there's broad perspectives on it. It's not just about, what data was involved and where did it go and things like that. It's about, okay, what are the reputational implications of this? What other teams need to be made aware so that they can be read in and prepared and not be surprised? Those are all human functions, and it's a human game in that sense. So this is something that just personally and professionally I've always sort of valued and sort of oriented toward. But I think, oftentimes, and I'm not shy about saying this, I think risk professionals have a little bit of a tendency, and guilty at times, I have to remind myself of this, to take that risk first, aggressive approach to solving problems or to securing a business. And like I said a couple of minutes ago, it really does boil down to, if security isn't usable, it isn't security at all. Because when you lose the buy-in and the trust of your customers or your employees through the means you are introducing to protect the business, they end up going around the controls that you've built. So a thing that I've mentioned in the past is culture as a control. I believe very strongly that you have to build and curate and maintain a healthy culture around security that's a two-way trust transaction. And I think that's true whether you're talking about your internal employees or your customer base.
Well, I could spend hours with you, John. Sadly, that's how my brain works. Picking apart everything, not picking apart, but just kind of digging into everything you've done, because I'm fascinated by big programs and projects like this. But I'm going to stick with, as we wrap here, stick with kind of the culture piece. And you mentioned early on looking at some data early to determine perhaps a good strategy to move forward with. And again, not giving anything away, which you haven't done. How do you know that you're on the path to success, and how do you communicate that within back to the culture piece?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different ways to approach that. I mean, obviously we have the more traditional means. We've got some metrics and some KPIs, which we're sort of watching, that are more traditional indicators of success. And I'm happy to describe examples of them. As I mentioned earlier, we look at the rate of recovery code download and, prints, for example. We also look at the number of account lockouts that are occurring and folks attempting recoveries. And then things a little less traditional, like one of the things that we did is attempted to sort of move folks gently away from SMS 2FA toward more secure options. And we've seen a reduction in those as an example. So those are obviously like the core things that you look at. But I think more importantly, there's some things that are hard to measure. And these are important, I think, for leaders, especially of cross-functional efforts like these. You got to look at the health of your team and what they tell you by how they communicate and what results they produce. I've been tremendously grateful, I think, or fortunate, I think, during this period to work with a bunch of folks who are deeply dedicated, who believe in the work and have done excellent collaborative work together. And that environment is palpable. The team is positive and engaged. And I think those are important things for leaders to pay attention to. If they're not seeing that kind of positivity, that kind of engagement, that kind of excitement to do this kind of work, even if it's outside the day-to-day for some of these folks, it may be a sign that you need to look at how you're setting up your project and what kind of environment you're sort of curating for the team.
I love it. Super cool. Well, perhaps you'll come back after your presentation and we can have a deeper chat. Until then, I have to see your talk and encourage everybody else to do the same. I think that it's no small feat to get security baked into business process through development and ops and customer success and all the other teams you mentioned. And so to hear this story at Black Hat, I think is super important. And it's Thursday, August 10th, 3:20 in the afternoon. 40 minutes of goodness from John Swanson, all about 2FA to, 100 million developers?
It's 100 million developers on the platform. That's right.
Love it. Well, John, thanks for giving us some insight and sharing a bit about the culture and the process. And again, I look forward to the session, and everybody listening, we'll include a link to that session so you can access that and John's profile on Twitter and whatnot, so you can connect with him there. And any other resources you find would be helpful, John, feel free to share those. And of course, stay tuned, everybody. There's lots coming from Hacker Summer Camp Black Hat USA 2023 as we continue our chats on the road to Las Vegas.
Thank you both. Appreciate it.
Subscribe, and there's not two-factor in playing this episode, so you can share it.
That's
and
right. It's free to play.
There's no dangers there as far as I know, anyway. But thank you very much.